Okay, folks, so this is the second section of consideration, and as you can see, the diagram we were working with is now on the left, and we have a new diagram on the right. Now, this diagram on the right, this looks at a particular type of agreement, and it is an agreement whereby an initial contract, so a contract is formed initially, and that contract is then varied in some sort of way. So what we need to look at is, when will the law find that there is adequate consideration to support a promise where that promise is contained in an agreement to change the contract? So, put very, very simply, we need to know when the law will find consideration when a contract is varied. Now, just looking up here, one of the things you'll learn in seminars and and lectures for consideration is about performance of a public duty. We don't have time to cover that. It looks at going above and beyond the statutory duty that you have. If you do that, then an agreement to change something is supported by consideration. Also, you may have a duty, so you're party A, you have a duty to party B, and there's an agreement to change the contract, but in changing the contract, the duty that you have is to a third party, and if you perform your end of the bargain towards a third party, then that can be supported by consideration. But it's this box at the end here. You should see contractual duty to same party. So really what that just means is, can performing an existing contract, just doing exactly what you were supposed to do in the first place, can that ever provide consideration to support an agreement to vary a contract? And the most controversial area here is an agreement to give or pay more for the same. So let's give a simple enough example. I agree to pay Bill £10,000 if he builds me a house by the 1st of December. So that's the agreement. Then something might happen where I think, Bill's not going to get this house built on time. So I go to Bill and I say, look, Bill, here's another £500 if you just get this house built on time. So I've changed the contract. I've changed the original contract, and what I've done is I have agreed to pay more, and Bill, lucky Bill, is just doing exactly what he originally promised to do anyway. So we have to ask the question, in this particular circumstance where there is an agreement to give or pay more, are such agreements supported by consideration? Now, before 1990, the answer would have been a very clear no, and that was from what we call the sealer cases. There are two cases, Stilcombe Myrick, Hartley and Ponsonby, as you can see from this diagram, which had remarkably similar facts, but let's have a look at them. They were really contracts, employment contracts in the 18th, 19th century for sailors to undergo a journey, undertake a journey, and then what happened is, somewhere after the contract was signed and they began to perform their end of the bargain, so they were on the ship doing the work, something happened which meant that employees, other sailors deserted the ship. So, in both cases, the captain came to the sailors that did not desert the ship and said, look, if you get this ship back to London, I will split the deserters' wages with you guys. In one case, that agreement, so that was changing the original agreement, it was altering how much you were going to get paid for doing what you said you would do in the first place, which was get the boat back to London. In one of those cases, the agreement was supported by consideration, and in the other it was not. And you can see here from the diagram, Stilcombe Myrick, it was not supported by consideration. Why was that? Because the number of sailors that deserted was, when you look at the context of the whole, the total number of employees was quite small. So I think, I don't know exact numbers, but I think 3 or 4 sailors deserted in a team of 12 or 13. So the journey became slightly different. The journey back to London for these employees became slightly different, but still within the ballpark of what they originally signed up to. So the agreement to give them the deserters' wages was not supported by consideration. Therefore, the sailors did not receive the extra money. If you compare that with Hartley and Ponsonby, as I said, very, very similar facts. But again, not knowing exact numbers, but I believe it was 5 or 6 sailors out of 9 or 10 deserted the ship. So the promise to give those particular sailors extra money was upheld because it was supported by consideration. And what was the consideration? Well, they went over and above, way over and above what they were expected to do. And you'll see this termed in the textbooks. They provided a legal benefit, a benefit in the eyes of the law. But the best way to think about it when you experience these type of problem questions or in a moot is really Hartley and Ponsonby was a case in which the sailors were successful because they went way over and above what was in the original agreement, what their obligations were in that first agreement. So up until 1990, those were the 2 cases that we had. You had to prove, if you made an agreement to pay more for the same, then the person who received this extra money, they had to prove to hold the party to account for the payment of extra money. They had to prove that they went way over and above what was expected from the original contract. If you could not do that, the agreement to pay more for the same failed because there was not adequate consideration. 1990 comes along. You can see at the bottom of the diagram on the right is the case of Williams and Roffey. This is an absolutely fundamental case to contract law and is extremely relevant to the issue of consideration and agreements to pay more. So, boiling this down, the facts of Williams and Roffey, it was a carpentry and building contract. There was a subcontractor in a building contract that agreed to refurbish flats. I think the venue was London. I can't be 100% sure. But to cut a long story short, there was an agreement in place that you build X amount of flats for a certain amount, and the carpenter subcontractor would be paid a certain amount as each of these flats was built. Now the problem was the main contractor realised that the subcontractor had difficulties and would not be completing on time. Now the problem for the main contractor was if the subcontractor did not complete on time, the main contractor was going to incur a penalty. So they did not want that to happen, so they went to their subcontractor and said, look, I know you're having problems. Here is a incentive for you. We're going to give you extra money if you can pay on if you can make the original deadlines. So that was the agreement. So as you can see, there was the original agreement to build the homes. We're now changing the agreement. We're saying, okay, we're going to build you the flats, but you've agreed to pay extra, so we're changing the contract. And as we know, if we had only Stilcombe, Myrick and Hartley and Ponsonby to apply, then we'd have to show that the carpenters were going way above what they originally were contracted to do, and they did not. They were simply re-agreeing to what they originally agreed to in the contract. So this is a problem if we just apply the law pre-1990. There's simply no consideration here. So the agreement to pay more for the same, you would think, is not supported by consideration. However, in Williams and Roffey, Lord Justice Glidewell came up with a test which recognised that really the law should not interfere in these type of agreements. So as long as there is a minimum threshold that is satisfied, then the law should give effect to an agreement to pay more for the same. Now it's very important to get the 6 requirements listed. Embarrassing if I can't remember them, but let's have a look. So, first requirement, A and B need to be in an existing relationship. We know in Williams and Roffey they had a contract, a building contract in place. So existing relationship only applies to parties in an existing legal relationship. The next requirement is that the promisor, the person making this promise of extra payment, at some point before at some point it comes to their notice that party B, the promisee, will not complete their end of the bargain. So it comes to their notice. Sometimes it's the promisee telling them, sometimes maybe it's a news item, sometimes it's someone in the trade tells them, but ultimately what needs to be shown is that the promisor knows that the promisee will not complete on time. The next requirement is that party A, the promisor, agrees to give something extra, usually an extra payment. Doesn't have to be, could be extra time, some sort of benefit. So they give something extra in order for the promisee to complete to the original agreement. The next requirement is that in order to extract that extra payment from the promisor, the promisee must not have engaged in any economic duress. Duress generally, usually economic if we're talking about businesses. So the person who's receiving this extra payment should not have engaged in economic duress in order to get this extra payment from the promisor. And this 5th requirement, and by far the most important, is that the promisor must have received some sort of practical benefit by paying this extra money. So we're looking at what the promisor receives, the promisor being the person that agrees to pay the extra money. We're looking to see if they have received a practical benefit. Now, what is a practical benefit? Now, this, to me, is one of the oddest tests in the whole of contract law. For me, a test is a test by definition because it implies that some people will pass, some people will fail. That cannot be said of the practical benefit test. Practical benefit test is any factual benefit which actually will accrue to the promisor or may hypothetically accrue to the promisor. Now let's put that in context. Imagine if I agree to renovate your living room, let's say your garage, for £1,000. I'm not going to be able to complete on time. You come to me and say, look, can you get this done on time? I'll pay you an extra £300 because in 4 weeks' time I am going to have people round to the garage to sell some of my paintings. Imagine I'm an amateur painter. So what we do to assess that agreement for consideration is we assess whether there is a factual benefit at the time the agreement to pay more is made. So at the time that I've agreed to pay more, I believe that in 4 weeks I will obtain a benefit because the garage will have been renovated and therefore I can have the opportunity to sell some paintings. Now, it does not it is of no it's no issue whatsoever if it actually transpires that I don't sell any paintings. It doesn't matter if actually I end up deciding not to have the event at all. What matters is at the time the promise was made to give more or pay more, there was a factual benefit or a hypothetical benefit which did not eventually transpire. That's all we need to show, and if we can show that, then the promise is supported by consideration. Now, if we go back to Williams and Roffey, you need to read into this yourselves, but there were a list of 6 or 7 practical benefits that the main contractor obtained by continuing with the contract and paying more to the subcontractor. But really, when you look at them, it's a clear example of the courts trying to effectively manufacture a benefit. You know, they say that one of them is, well, by agreeing to pay more, the main contractor avoided a penalty clause in the main contract. Yes, that's true, but they were going to avoid that anyway if the promisee the subcontractor had performed their end of the bargain. The other one that they say is, well, the practical benefit could be that they had a more orderly payment process in place after the new agreement. Well, again, that payment process was exactly on the same terms as what was originally agreed. So where is this the benefit, this fresh consideration, this fresh benefit that we need to find? And the answer is, it's nowhere. Can't be found. And that's why there's a great article on Westlaw in which the practical benefit test is described as an illusory test. It's not a test at all, because it can always be satisfied. So that raises the question, why even have the requirement of consideration in agreements to pay more? It seems that we're manipulating the rules of consideration so much that we don't need to have this requirement of consideration for agreements to pay more. So let's have a look to the left hand of the screen. Remember what I said about the rules of consideration, and I also said that they are applied in a more lenient fashion for alteration agreements. So if we are talking about agreements to pay more for the same, let's have a look. Look at the first one. So consideration need not be adequate but must be sufficient. I said in the first screencast, so we need to provide something of value, some economic value in the eyes of the law. In agreements to pay more for the same, the promisee is providing nothing. So you could call into question whether agreements to pay more for the same satisfy the first rule of consideration. And look at this. Look at the second rule. Consideration must move from the promisee. We were very clear in the last screencast, that is the rule. But with agreements to pay more for the same, we don't really look at what the promisee provides. The promisee is just doing what they were supposed to do anyway. What we do instead is we look at whether the promisor received a practical benefit. So again, look how we are manipulating the rules of consideration to suit this agreement, to make sure we uphold this agreement. The past consideration is no consideration. It's not overly relevant, but you can see from an agreement to pay more for the same, there's no real issue with past consideration. But with those first two requirements, we are bending and manipulating the rules of consideration so that we uphold an agreement to pay more. I have no problem with the rule. Upholding these agreements. I believe personally, and I know David Kepper does, such agreements should be upheld. What I would disagree with is this artificial way in which we do it. We insist on finding consideration in the form of practical benefit. Well, that benefit's going to be found every single time. So why have the test at all? The argument would be that you have the quite strict requirements for formation agreements, and with alteration agreements, such as an agreement to pay more for the same, you rely on the fourth requirement of a valid contract, which is simply intention to create legal relations. So that's very important. We should just. Why do we even need to have consideration for agreements to change? Or sorry, agreements to pay more for the same. So that's quite an interesting topic. Lots of articles on that, but again, not strictly relevant to the moot. With that in mind, what we're going to do is move on to another type of agreement. Just before we do, it's important to remember here what I'm saying about Williams and Roffey, the practical benefit test, because what happens in the case of MWB and Rock Advertising is Lady Justice Arden attempts to say, wrongly in my opinion, that the practical benefit test can be used not just in agreements to pay more for the same, but with agreements to accept less. So instead of giving more for the same, we're talking about agreements where I have a contract in place for, say, a loan of £10,000. Someone comes to me and says, look, will you accept £7,000? In that scenario, Lady Justice Arden has suggested that the agreement is supported by consideration. So you can hold the person to account who said they would accept £7,000. You can hold that person to account if it can be shown that the promisee, the person receiving the benefit, or the person who is benefiting from the part payment, if you can show that that person also provided a practical benefit to the promisor. So this will all make more sense when we go and look at that particular type of agreement, part payment of debt, and agreements to accept less. So I'm just going to do a quick screen change here. So you'll notice the diagram on the right here will change with more relevant cases. That will happen, I think, instantly. So I will be hoping that works now. Okay, so I thought I did have a diagram for these type of agreements, but no. So let's make do with what we have. It's probably best if you have a textbook to hand for this section, so you can have a look at the case law that I'm referencing. But we've still got the rules of consideration on the left. With a little scenario here, it's a typical type of contract. So let's say John lends Dave £600 to be paid back in 6 monthly instalments on the 1st of February 2018. I'm going to change that. 1st of September 2016. So we've got John, the promisor. He gives Dave the money, it's £600, and this is the payment schedule. So he has to pay £100 as a periodic agreement, periodic repayments, £100 each month. So we can see it's an interest-free loan, total repayment of £600. Now this is the original agreement in bold here. We've got the original agreement, that's the formation agreement. So it's very simple. John gives Dave £600, paid over 6 months. But let's change this slightly. And let's say that Dave goes to John and says, would he accept, let's say £500 as full and final settlement. Let's imagine that the reason Dave is doing that is he's got his own financial difficulties, he's lost his job, I don't know, make up a reason. And what we need to look at is John here is trying to change the contract. There's no agreement to pay more for the same like Williams and Roffey. This is what we call an agreement to accept less. Okay, an agreement to accept less, or sometimes in journal articles you will see this, the term used is a decreasing pact. Decreasing pact. So what we need to ask ourselves is, when will the law say that this agreement to accept less than what was originally agreed, when will that be upheld in the sense that it's supported by consideration? That's a very tricky area, but also in terms of practical significance, this is very, very important, because such agreements are entered into all the time. Especially after the credit crunch, we've still not really recovered, so people are still in debt and trying to write off a lot of that debt. Excuse me. So let's just see. What does the law say on this? Well, you have the general rule. I'm going to give you the case law for that is Pinnell's case, Foakes and Beer, re-select move. Now, Foakes and Beer was heard in the House of Lords, which is now the Supreme Court, was heard about 100 years ago, if not more. I think it may be even more than 125. I want to say 1896. Someone check that, but I think it's around then. And what the House of Lords said is, the general rule is that if you agree to pay something or give something, then you have to pay or give something. There's no getting off with it. So if someone comes along and agrees to accept £500 to satisfy a debt of £600, the general rule is that there is absolutely nothing in the law that says that agreement can be upheld. So there is nothing to prevent, in this example, even if he agrees to accept 500, there is nothing in the future to prevent John from going back to Dave after and saying, look, Dave, I know I said I'd accept £500, but no, I want the £100 outstanding. So that's the general rule, and it was formed in Pinnell's case, which I think is around the 17th century, confirmed in Foakes and Beer, and very interestingly, this case of re-select move was an attempt to apply the practical benefit test in Williams and Roffey. Remember, we talked about practical benefit is factual benefit, very low threshold, and it was shot down. The argument was shot down. It says in re-select move, even if we wanted to, the judges actually concede that yes, well, we do feel that perhaps practical benefit should be allowed in this type of bound precedent, and we say that practical benefit test cannot be used in agreements to accept less. It's very important to remember that for this moot. So that's the general rule, but there are two exceptions. So let's look at exception 1. And exception 1 is where there is an agreement to accept less, and the requirement is that there must be accord and satisfaction to accept less. So, what do we mean by accord? Very simply, the parties have agreed. There is an agreement to accept less. And so what do we mean by satisfaction? There must be fresh consideration. There must be something extra other than the part payment provided in this agreement to accept less for it to be upheld. And something extra might be pay part of your debt 1 week before it is due, pay part in a different currency, different location, something a bit more technical, but if you pay part of your debt as part of what's called in insolvency law individual voluntary agreement, then that's fine as well. So that's the common law exception, and the authority for that is still Pinnell's case, Foakes and Beer, re-select move. These cases reinforce that there are exceptions to the general rules. There's no need to introduce any new case law on that. So let's take the example here we have with John and Dave. So imagine if Dave goes to John and says, would he accept 500 as full and final settlement if paid on the 1st of August. So he's agreeing to pay part payment of the full debt, but he's going to pay that in full by the 1st of August. So what we need to look at is this agreement supported by consideration? If we apply the general rule, no, it's not. But he's agreeing to pay it before the due date when the loan is due to be completely repaid. So the argument would be, yes, there is consideration provided for this particular agreement to accept less. What does that mean in practical terms? It means if there is consideration provided, the agreement to accept less can be upheld, and therefore Dave cannot come back to John and say, oi, give me that £100 that you didn't pay of the 600. So that would be the outcome. But let's revert back to the original problem. And what we said was, if Dave goes to John and says, would he accept 500 as full and final settlement? We said that's not provided, or that's not supported by consideration. The exceptions don't apply. And up until relatively recently, that would have been the end of the game for these agreements to accept less. But what has happened is a new doctrine. Well, I say a new doctrine. It's nearly 40, 50, if not 60 years old. A new doctrine has come into play which can still save this agreement to accept less and thus prevent Dave from suing for the £100 balance. And that doctrine, as I'm sure you will all know by now, is the doctrine of promissory estoppel. Now, one thing that students consistently make an error with, and I'm sure you guys will not, but it's very important to remember this. The doctrine of promissory estoppel can only be used for agreements to accept less. The doctrine of promissory estoppel cannot be used in any shape or form for agreements to pay more for the same, i.e. Williams and Roffey type situations. It will become clear why that is, but the whole nature of promissory estoppel is giving up on your strict legal rights. So you had your strict legal rights in the original contract, you're sort of surrendering or giving up some of those. So that's in complete contradistinction to the notion of more for the same. So please don't get into the habit of thinking that promissory estoppel applies to all alteration promises. It applies only for agreements to accept less. Usually, but not always, they are part payment of debt type situations. But again, it doesn't have to be. It could be a scenario whereby there is a service contract to deliver 100 cars to a particular site each month, and one of the parties comes to the other and says, look, things are a bit tight at the moment, staff numbers are down, can we for a few months deliver 50 cars to you instead of 100? Again, that's an example of an agreement to accept less, which isn't about debt or money. So it's important to remember that as well. And saying that your moot is clearly about debt, if we interpret debt in the broadest of terms, being a rental agreement. So I know I did say I would do this in 3, but I'm splitting this into 4. What I'll do with the next screencast is go through the requirements of promissory estoppel. There are 6 requirements, and you must tick all 6 boxes in order to avail of this doctrine of promissory estoppel. So that will be the focus of Screencast 3. Screencast 4 will then move on to MWB and rock advertising. Okay, thank you.